So, without any further ado, this is about innovation accounting in Scrum, okay? Innovation accounting is a term that was originated, as far as I can tell, it's certainly been popularized by Eric Ries, who wrote a book called The Lean Startup. It must be, about 6 years ago now. In fact, I first read The Lean Startup when I was working with David Boyd at the Open University. I remember reading it in my lunch hours there. So innovation accounting is basically it's an alternative to traditional accounting, and it's very appropriate for agile ways of working. So what we're going to be doing in this presentation is we are going to first of all be looking at very old-fashioned, traditional ways of accounting for value. The way those methods of accounting for value have been sort of kludged onto agile ways of working. We'll consider that as well. And then in the last part of the presentation, it'll be probably about half an hour before we get there, we'll actually start looking at what innovation accounting is about, and we'll be going through a worked example. So bear with me for about, I don't know, that might be about 20, 25 minutes, I suppose. It will be quite half an hour, while we go through some basics of how value is accounted for in agile ways of working such as Scrum, and what innovation accounting means and how it changes things, okay? So to begin with, we'll start with a film. We'll start with a film that was made in 1965, starring Charlton Heston. It was called The Agony and the Ecstasy. And Charlton Heston, he played Michelangelo, as you know, painted the Sistine Chapel in Rome. And there, I remember, I saw this film when I was a kid on I was watching it on television, and I remember Charlton Heston as Michelangelo painting the Sistine Chapel, and he had this wooden scaffolding that was going all the way up to the ceiling of the chapel, and he was lying on his back with his paintbrushes. He must have been about maybe not even a foot away from the ceiling himself. His nose was, almost pushed up against it, and he was putting in all of this detail, loads of detail into his painting of David and all of the other prophets and everything that was painting on the chapel there. And I remember one scene, the Pope would be walking along, he'd be conducting some sort of service in the chapel, and he would look up and he would ask Michelangelo, in fact he'd mouth the words, "When will you make an end to this? When will you make an end to this work of art you're producing?" Because you see, Michelangelo was this perfectionist. He was adding detail that nobody could see from down below on the ground. And the Pope wanted to know, when will you make an end? When will you be done? And Michelangelo always mouthed back the same answer: "When I am finished." Okay, he wasn't going to be time boxed. He wasn't going to be time bound. It will be over. It will be finished when I am finished. Okay. Now that's very, very similar to words that we hear being spoken today. When will the project be done? When will it be over? When will it be finished? I suppose you've probably heard those words many times yourselves. When will the project be finished? And you might be able to put a number of voices to that question. Lots of people will have asked you that. Project managers, stakeholders, perhaps. The Pope might never have asked you, but the question nevertheless remains very, very significant, and it's got very significant implications. If someone is asking you, when will the project be done? Okay, there are some significant and telling things that we can draw from that, right? So the first implication, if someone asks you, when will the project be done? What that suggests is that any value delivered so far has been inadequate. That's why they're asking you the question in the first place. It's because they're impatient. And it might be that as of yet, no value's been generated at all. Nothing's been evidenced. If it's a waterfall way of working, that's how you could expect things to be. No value will have been generated at all yet. They'll be waiting. They'll be waiting until perhaps a stage gate has been reached, or perhaps until the very end of the project. It might be that you're following an iterative and incremental type of process, and it might very well be that value is being delivered early and often, but they just can't see it. It might be that the scaffolding of work in progress is blocking their view. It might be, for example, that although a lot of work has been done, it's perhaps in a development environment rather than a release or a pre-release environment. Yeah, just as the scaffolding that Michelangelo was, lying on to paint the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel got in the way of people's view down below, got in the Pope's way, so the infrastructure and the apparatus that you have as a developer, as a development team, may get in the way of anyone being able to witness the value that you're developing and delivering, even in a supposedly agile way of working. Unless you are delivering increments that are genuinely done, as per the Scrum Guide, they meet a definition of done, there could be all sorts of work in progress that's blocking someone's view of what it is that's been delivered. There might be technical debt that's been incurred, for example. Yeah, nevertheless, work will have been done. It's just unevidenced and unappreciated at the moment. That is one of the implications of someone asking you, when will the project be done? It's because no value has been evidenced yet, for one reason or another. Either because nothing's been generated, or because they just can't see it yet. It's not been released in a clear, appreciable way yet for them. Now, there's a second implication too. If you hear stakeholders asking you, when will the project be done, that also implies that the creative process lies outside of their control, okay? They don't feel as if they're fully franchised as part of what's going on. Yeah, I mean, the Pope looking up wasn't an artist himself who could, really feel as if he exerted much control over Michelangelo's creativity. He was expecting things to happen, but he wasn't entirely franchised. He was asking, when will it be done? When will it be done? When will you make a finish? So that's why people are asking that question of you. It's because they see you as being the person who's in control of value and its delivery. So they're asking you, when will it be finished? When will I start seeing evidence? And you can immediately tell from that, if you're used to an agile way of working, you can immediately infer from that there's a problem, because if you are following an agile delivery mechanism, you as a developer or as a development team would not expect to be fully in control. You would expect to be working with the business, with stakeholders. So value is evidenced early and often, okay? You would know and expect that you yourself as a developer would not be the only person in control here. In fact, control would be driven by the business. They'd be looking at what you're producing, perhaps in a sprint review, let's say, and they'd be advising you accordingly. That's what you would expect in an agile way of working. So there's an implication there. If you believe you are working in an agile way, and yet people are asking you, when will the project be done? It tells you that something's amiss somewhere, okay? Now, it makes more sense to hear that question in classic project management, because their stakeholders would expect perhaps not to be fully franchised as part of the engineering process, yeah? And they might experience limited involvement once a mandate's been signed off, for example. The mandate's been signed off, they expect to see evidence at the very end of that classic waterfall project, yeah? But because they're not getting any feedback, because an empirical process control loop is not being closed, because that feedback is absent, as time goes on, the voice becomes increasingly shrill. When will the project be done? Because they're spending money. They're spending money, they're investing in what it is you're doing as a development team, but they're not seeing anything back yet. So this question, when will the project be done, becomes more and more anxious as time goes on. So what does the question really tell us? Well, hearing when will the project be done tells us that something is wrong in a number of ways. It tells us that stakeholders are looking for a definitive endpoint at which significant value will be released, instead of maximizing value delivery on an incremental and ongoing basis, yeah? So you know if you're supposedly following an agile way of working, something's wrong there. They're looking for that definitive endpoint when they should be receiving value iteratively and incrementally, perhaps every sprint. It also tells you that stakeholders have not yet obtained empirical evidence of a return on any investment. And so they can't forecast the likely value of any continued funding. Remember, they're still funding you, they're still giving you money to do whatever it is you're doing, but they're not seeing any evidence of return yet. Yeah? So the question is telling you that too. It also tells you that the stakeholders don't recognize the endpoint to be something which lies under their control. And if you're following an agile way of working like Scrum, well, the endpoint should lie under stakeholders' control, yeah? Through the product owner, they should be able to decide when it is that they would like the sprints, the sprint cycle to finish. That may be that they've received enough value already. Okay, it may be that they don't believe that it's worthwhile continuing by funding any further sprints. Perhaps they've got enough value as it is already. So the endpoint should be something that lies under their control all the time. So those three things are all suggesting that agile delivery is not in effect. Okay? Right, now I'm going to have to pause for a second because we've got a slight admin issue, which is that my pizza has just arrived, apparently. I tell you what, can you talk amongst yourselves for about 4 minutes while I go out and get a pizza and bring it in? Is that okay?
No problem at all. Yeah. Yeah, that was good. 6 o'clock supposed to be. That's the Aberdeen Domino's branch.
So, for example,
I've got it, David.
on Elm Street, right?
Okay.
Watch it now.
Awesome. Okay. I'm glad it came eventually.
Did you watch that or the new Marvel film?
So,
Oh, the new Marvel film.
Is it worth the wait?
Yeah, it is. It is now.
Good. I'm jealous now.
Right, okay, so where was I? Yeah, I finished the slide. So what this question indicates is that agile delivery is not actually in effect. Because stakeholders are they're looking for this definitive endpoint. They haven't yet received any evidence, and they believe that the endpoint is not something that lies under their control. Now, agility is a game changer in this, because in an incremental agile way of working, that question, when will the project be done, when will you make a finish, that should not arise. The implications of value either not being generated or simply of not being apparent shouldn't hold true at all. Value should always be evident in an agile way of working. You see, in a waterfall way of working, we have this large leap of faith before value is delivered. But in an agile way of working, each leap of faith is reduced to one sprint. Yeah? So each little square box that you have there represents a sprint in effect, and the leap of faith that a development team is expected to take should never be longer than that. At the end of one sprint, you should be seeing some proof of value, some value being evidenced. Now, in Scrum, value is a recurring theme, and a clear role is elicited where the responsibility for value must lie, and of course that is the product owner. And just as a Scrum Master is sometimes described as being a servant leader, so a product owner is sometimes described as being a value maximizer. That's effectively what a product owner really is. It is someone who maximizes the value of the product. So if someone wants to know when will the project be done, the right person to ask is effectively the product owner, because that's the person who will be making decisions about whether or not there should be another sprint. That's the person who would know how large the product backlog currently is, and what the rate of delivery is, what the throughput is, what the velocity is, and will be able to make a necessary calculation. The product owner is accountable for the value that's been obtained so far and how much remains to be provided, and whether the cost of doing so is likely to be justified. So it's the product owner who should decide on behalf of the stakeholders if and when sprinting is no longer justified and an endpoint to the initiative has been reached. So if you hear the question being asked and you're the Scrum Master, as if you're an experienced Scrum Master, if you're used to Scrum, you probably know yourself that the correct answer to this is, you say, well, ask the product owner. That's the person who should really know. Yeah, when will the project be done? Now, a product owner might account for value in any number of ways. Scrum as a framework is quite agnostic about how a product owner does that, how a product owner accounts for value. And in fact, the notion of value could differ between different industries. A supermarket will be different to a bank. I mean, a charity, of course, may not measure value in terms of even of money. It might be measured in terms of KPIs for the social good or something of that nature. And the ways of assessing value are probably as varied as the number of complex products that can be delivered. Scrum doesn't prescribe because it tries to be as general as possible in order to avoid constraining people's options. All you can really say about the way a product owner will account for value in Scrum is that it will be maximized sprint by sprint. The product owner will order a product backlog. The ordering will reflect the way in which the product owner believes value ought to be maximized in order to create the best possible outcome for stakeholders. Now, here's a brute force method, almost like a formula, if you like, that a product owner might be tempted to employ when accounting for value. I'll just go through it. I mean, it might make your head spin a bit, but it's perfectly, we'll break it down into steps. It's actually quite straightforward. So step one, stakeholders might estimate the value of each item in the product by means of value poker. Okay, so they could use monopoly money or whatever to estimate the value, not the size. We aren't talking story points here. We're talking value points. As I say, it could be monopoly money, it could be some abstract number, but they'll estimate value. Remember, by the way, that a product backlog item in Scrum has a description, an order, a value, and an estimate. Yeah. So there's nothing odd here in getting people to estimate value. It doesn't happen very often, perhaps, compared to estimating size or complexity, but it's actually part, if you like, of the Scrum framework that the item will have value. Next, the development team estimate the size of the product backlog, such as by means of planning poker. That's the classic exercise where you've got the development team with the planning poker cards and they're saying, this is a 3, this is a 5, this is a 13. Okay? The development team then estimate their likely velocity each sprint. Yeah, that might be by experience, they might know what their velocity is, it might be by gut feel, it might be some other method, but they get their velocity. Now, those first 3 steps are absolutely standard. There shouldn't be any head scratching at this point. It's what you would probably do anyhow. Maybe the only thing that's a little bit odd is the idea of using value poker. 4th step, again, very, very straightforward. Divide the size of the product backlog by the velocity to calculate the projected number of sprints. There's nothing that's unusual there. You've probably all experienced that to some extent. Now what we do is we divide the total estimated value of the product backlog, right? Because each item's value is estimated. We divide that total by the projected number of sprints, which we just calculated in step 4, to calculate the projected value per sprint. Then, step 6, we estimate the cost of funding for each sprint, taking into account team size, the salaries, the fixed costs, the price of keeping the lights on, and so on. We estimate the cost of running each sprint. And then the last step, we divide the projected value per sprint by the estimated cost per sprint to yield the projected return on investment per sprint. Now, that looks like, to many people, a perfectly sensible and reasonable sort of calculation. It's going to tell you what the value is per sprint, or so you would think. However, let's make some observations on that method. All this method really does, the one that I've just covered there in that previous slide, all this method really does is to show it is possible to dial certain numbers into a formula, into an equation, turn a handle, so to speak, and you get other numbers out. A product owner can calculate the projected number of residual sprints and an average return on investment per sprint. And that can be done at any time during a project with respect to the work which is thought to remain. So that mechanism that we've got there, product owner could use that at any point during an initiative to calculate the return on investment and whether or not it's worthwhile continuing sprinting. And a value-based decision, so-called, might then be made on whether or not to continue. However, this is a completely blockheaded approach. Why is this blockheaded? It looks so sensible. Yeah, you estimate the value, you estimate the size, the velocity, you put the numbers in, you turn the handle, it tells you what the ROI per sprint is. And it's not wrong. I mean, the calculation, there's no error in the formula there, but it's still a blockheaded approach. Because what it doesn't do, what that method that I've just outlined there, that brute force method, what it doesn't do is to allow for a variation in worth or in value across the increments themselves. That's critical, because there's no reason in an agile way of working to assume that each sprint, each iteration, each increment that is provided is going to yield exactly the same value. It's a crazy idea. Of course, some sprints are going to be delivering more value or less value. It's not going to be the same. They're going to be doing their own special things. They're going to be meeting sprint goals. They're going to be leveraging the latest and greatest opportunities to build something. They're not necessarily going to be consistent in what they're doing in terms of the value they're providing. There's no reason why they should. So the problem with that mechanism that we just went and looked at there, which looked so sensible, is that value is calculated up front. It's then pureed and spread out evenly over each future iteration. The ROI is always going to be the same. You're calculating a flat ROI per sprint. And reality doesn't work out that way. If you're working in an agile approach, you would not expect value to be pureed and spread out evenly over each sprint. You'd expect each sprint to be doing its own thing. You'd be planning its own body of work, its own sprint backlog. It would be meeting its own sprint goal. The value would be very, very special. Yeah. You see, in reality, value is emergent. The outcome of one iteration or sprint can and should influence the value which is planned and delivered in the next sprint. That's validated learning. It's why we should be interested in following agile practice in the first place. Yeah? It's allowing us to build the right thing at the right time, irrespective of how much value there is in one sprint or one increment compared to the next. Each increment may be expected to achieve different things, perhaps with quite different goals, and some iterations are going to be worth more than others. So that brute force approach, which looked so reasonable, is unreasonably predictive, yeah? Because that value is unlikely to be spread out evenly across all of the iterations. There is no reason to suppose that it would be. So the shortcomings of predictive value accounting. Well, no allowance is made for adaptive change and validated learning. The emergent nature of value, okay, which is critical to Scrum, that's why you would use it in the first place, that comes from inspection and adaptation. It's just not taken into account when you try and have that kind of blockheaded formula for working out how much value is going to be delivered in a sprint. In short, no thought is given to the innovative potential that lies within the agile delivery mechanism. And yet, without harnessing that innovative potential, without appreciating that each sprint is going to be doing something special, it's going to be delivering something unique, if you don't appreciate that, there's not much chance of learning anything or improving. Predicting value in that way certainly is nonsensical. A predictive calculation in Scrum is unrealistic. It makes a nonsense of using Scrum or any other agile delivery mechanism in the first place. See, if you really wanted to be predictive about the return on investment, about the value that's being delivered, if you weren't interested in empiricism, in seeing each sprint as being a unique opportunity to learn something, then there's not much point in using Scrum or in adopting an iterative and incremental approach in the first place. So we don't really want to be predictive. It looks sensible, but to us, it's nonsense. That brings us to innovation accounting. So we've looked at the background of, traditional accounting and some of the mechanisms that, accountants might be tempted to use. Now what we're going to do is we're going to look beyond that sort of coarse or blockheaded method and towards a more useful way of assessing emergent value. And that's the innovation accounting approach I talked about at the very beginning. So we're going to look at an illustrative example of how this might work. Yeah? In this example, we're going to consider a public sector health service initiative in a distant country where you've been brought in as an Agile consultant. Okay? Public sector health service initiative, and you're there as an Agile consultant. So, welcome to Ruralania, that's the name of this country. There are few towns of any size in Ruralania. The city, Ruralpol, is the largest, and half of the country's inhabitants live there. The capital has the best equipped hospital in the land with 800 beds, 5 operating theatres and outpatient services. It's got an MRI scanner. The rest of the country is made up of remote and scattered villages with only a few landlines. However, mobile phone use has expanded greatly over the past 10 years, where there's very good network coverage now. They recognise the market opportunity to move in, given that people didn't have landlines, and today it's normal for Ruralanians to have a smartphone of some kind. So perhaps it's kind of like skipped a certain level of technological development and it's moved straight up to high tech and to having smartphone connectivity. The village hospitals. Each outlying village, this is outside of the capital of course, has a hospital or clinic averaging 20 beds, although many have only 4 or 5. There are a couple of operating theatres in each facility, but the more difficult cases are referred to the capital. Due to the remoteness of the locations, these village hospitals, and a historical lack of infrastructure, a comprehensive IT capability has never been developed for the health service there. There's no network, there's no IT network that links hospitals with each other, and there's no consistency in terms of the IT estate. All you can really say about the infrastructure, the IT infrastructure that exists in each hospital, is each one's going to have some sort of working landline. They at least do have these working landlines. So your project is this. Funding's been obtained for technical uplift across the health service there in Ruralania. And the first initiative is to upgrade and centralise the patient management system. That's a pet project of the Ruralanian health minister, who's its senior sponsor. And he wants each hospital in the country to be able to record and update the beds it has available in real time. Patients can then be transferred as swiftly as possible to the next nearest clinic if the local one is full. He forecasts treatment efficiencies there of 28 million rubles a year. New PCs will be installed to provide consistency of estate, and bandwidth demands will be kept low to support the existing landline capability. Again, that looks very sensible. Yeah, it looks sensible. You're going to have consistency of estate. There's going to be new PCs that are installed. He's not going to be over-ambitious. He's going to keep the bandwidth demands low so the analog landlines can be utilised effectively. Looks very, very sensible. But then again, that brute force calculation we saw earlier also looked very, very sensible, and we found out that it wasn't. So you have concerns about this value proposition. You're suspicious about the fundamental use case itself because it's predicated upon the manual entry of data. It doesn't make use of automated patient tagging that you might have on wristbands, let's say, or something like that. You point out that it could be a missed opportunity not to go straight to that, not to go straight to automated patient tagging. Why enter information manually into a computer, into a PC, when you could have the very, very latest in terms of patient tagging, reduce the chances of error? But the minister considers the idea of tagging to be too far-fetched. It's too radical. Yeah? He understands the idea of having people, hospital administrators, entering data into these PCs, and that's what he wants consistency around. Yeah, and as long as it doesn't exceed the bandwidth capabilities of the landlines when hospitals are communicating with each other to refer patients from one facility to another, as long as that's okay, he's going to be happy. So it's fairly low tech, even though it's about technical uplift. So you start. I mean, that health minister's the guy who's holding the purse strings. He's the chief voice of the requirements. So you get started. But unfortunately, after the first couple of sprints, it becomes clear that the hospital staff aren't really engaging with that new system at all. Data entry is very patchy, and it can't be relied upon for accuracy. The project looks like it'll be a dismal failure, and the health minister's afraid of losing face. So you avoid saying, I told you so, and you head up country to find out exactly what's going on. Why isn't the use case actually working? Why is data entry so patchy? And, you know, why can it not be relied upon for accuracy? Well, what you discover is that in most of the hospitals, the staff just track bed availability in their heads. If they ever have any doubt about capacity, which they hardly ever do, they just walk a few paces, look at their wards. Remember, there's about 20 beds in each ward, and they see how many are in fact available. They just look. Admissions and discharges are generally recorded in a physical ledger. That's the way they've been doing things for decades. And the new system, where they enter it all into a PC, seems strange to them. It means extra work, and they see no clear incentive to use it. So that use case isn't panning out too well. But when you are there, in the field, so to speak, in those village hospitals, you notice that a completely unforeseen use case has emerged. The new system happens, serendipitously almost, to include an elementary messaging feature of sorts. The intention behind it was to allow real-time qualitative observations and clarifications to be entered regarding hospital status. But it's being used very creatively by the hospital staff, even though the fields concerning bed availability are largely ignored. Now, admittedly, because Rural-Ania is a cricket-crazy country, sometimes the doctors just use that feature for talking about cricket and updating, you know, the village cricket scores. But they've also found that by tethering to a 4G connection, a new and valuable application becomes possible. So if they tether the PC to a 4G connection and don't use the landlines at all, a new use case emerges. What they found is that by tethering to a 4G connection, they can use an attachment capability. They can send photographs and x-rays to each other, or they can consult regarding MRI scans who've been referred from the capital. This is incredibly useful, okay? They're not really using the system for recording hospital beds, but as a means of being able to communicate with each other and consult with each other regarding patient x-rays and scans and diagnoses and so on, it's working great. They haven't really had a capability like this before. Now they've got one. Also, or rather they've discovered it. They've made it up for themselves with this capability. They've largely invented it. They're going to use this messaging facility for that purpose. Also, the nursing staff have discovered that they can use that messaging capability as a forum for exchanging medical supplies. It's not just patients who can be moved from one hospital to another. Medical supplies can be as well. So they've developed an ad hoc convention of prepending supplies to a comment. And they found that to be easier than phoning around and going through the Rural-Anian bureaucracy for ordering hospital supplies. They just do swaps amongst themselves. So this messaging capability, in a completely unforeseen way, has also provided them with that capability as well. So you make a recommendation at this point. You suggest to the health minister that he might pivot to these new use cases instead. Yeah? It's not really about recording bed availability anymore. It's really the use case, the valuable use cases are going to be for doctors to be able to exchange x-rays, notes, diagnoses, MRI scans, photographs, all sorts of information that they need to be able to communicate effectively regarding patient health and outcomes. Also, another valuable use case to focus on would be the ability to control inventory and to allow hospitals to swap inventory. Some of them might have a surplus of surgical swabs, some of them might not have enough disinfectant, let's say, so they arrange swaps amongst themselves, yeah, which is, you know, a very, very sensible thing to do rather than ordering surplus stock from the Rural-Anian capital. So he agrees to this suggestion. He sees it's going to save a lot of money in supply chain efficiencies and so on. So moving forward, the system will support the exchange of medical inventory and patient data, while making use of that new mobile infrastructure which is already in place. You see, the original use case didn't take into account the fact that the mobile infrastructure in the country was very, very solid and robust. It was based on an old landline capability. He also agrees to look again at the possibility of patient tagging, which he now accepts may be a more reliable indicator of hospital utilization, because people weren't buying into the idea of entering the data into PCs. Yeah, they see it as being a necessary duplication. But if they've got tagging there, where patients are effectively just scanned with barcodes or QR codes or whatever, that's a new and more reliable value proposition for those hospital staff. So he's agreeing again to look at the possibility of that. So this is innovation accounting then. So let's look at the lessons learned here about what innovation accounting means. Trying to predict the value that will be obtained from an evolving and complex system often proves to be a fool's errand. You can't do it. You can't realistically calculate how much value is going to be incurred in a particular sprint by averaging things out and assuming that the value is going to be equal across all sprints. It's not going to be like that. You can't predict the value when you're learning about the value proposition itself, when you're testing, when you're releasing increments sprint by sprint into a market. In this case, in Ruralania, you're releasing increments into a hospital environment, you know, and you're learning as you're going along. What do people find useful? What do they not find useful? How do you steer the way value is being developed and delivered, so value ultimately is maximized? The hard financial forecasts of conventional accounting can look rock solid, in other words, but they reassure us with false certainty, and they're pixie dust rather than precision. Yeah? The value is something that is learned sprint by sprint by sprint. It's about validated learning. It's usually best to formulate an hypothesis, test it as soon as possible, and then inspect into that progress based on what you actually see, what you see people doing, the empirical evidence that you obtain. New and better ideas can then be proposed and tested in turn. That's exactly what we saw in that little worked example there. We saw new and better ideas that, you know, perhaps couldn't even have been guessed at by the stakeholders, or they certainly wouldn't have believed them to begin with until the evidence was there. However a product owner defines value, it ought to be predicated on that empiricism, on that validated learning, yeah? Not on putting numbers into an equation or a formula and turning a handle, but by learning sprint by sprint about what it is that's actually being delivered and how it is valued in its environment. Once that core discipline of validated learning is brought to bear, a more appropriate means of assessing value then becomes possible, so that even the most basic premise can be revised. That's what validated learning is. So innovation accounting ought to be appreciated in terms of the validated actions which can be taken sprint by sprint based on the empirical evidence obtained. So if you've got a certain amount of funding, okay, you would use each sprint as an opportunity, okay, to find a sustainable value proposition. That's what was happening in that Ruralanian case study. We didn't have a sustainable value proposition to begin with. We ended up with one. And it was completely unforeseen. That's validated learning and how it plays into innovation accounting. So that process of innovation accounting is more likely to represent the best use of capital than persisting with a discredited value proposition. What you will find in Agile practice is that the most limiting constraint to any of this is the speed at which the Agile organization is prepared to learn, okay? It's not really about when will the project be done, when will you make a finish. That's not really the constraint. The constraint is what is the speed at which the Agile organization is prepared to learn. That's at the fundamental, that's the fundamental part, the fundamental component, if you like, of an Agile way of working. So that is it, pretty much on the nail in 45 minutes. So if there are any questions about any of these slides we've gone through, about innovation accounting, validated learning, now you can ask them and I'll do my best to answer them. Okay?
So we'll ask questions. would it be helpful for you to be able to see us? In this So if you stop, that's it. You should be able to see us now.
Yeah, I can see. I can see you now. I'll just. Well, I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll just move this over there, and I'll have this here, so I can skip back a bit through slides if I have to. Okay, questions.
So, when you said which speed the Agile organisation is prepared to learn, do you mean that they're going to have to spend more money on the sprints before they start seeing value, so they have to be patient? Is that what you mean by that?
Not really. It's the speed at which they are prepared to accept that they can spend a little on one sprint and expect to see a result, expect to see value at the end of that sprint. That's what we mean by the speed of the organisation being prepared to learn. In Agile practice, they have the opportunity to actually get something of value by the end of a sprint. You don't have to look to 10 sprints ahead or at the end of a so-called project. You can get value at the end of every sprint, and the sooner organisations learn that, the sooner they will be able to benefit from it. That's what we mean by the constraint being the speed at which the Agile organisation is prepared to learn. They can get value every sprint, but they may not realise it yet, so they're not going to get it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but I guess the value may not cover the cost.
It may not. Well, you're right. It may not cover the cost. It may not cover the cost, but it may still be worth sprinting if they find that an hypothesis has been confirmed. It might still be worth continuing.
Because then the value may come 3 sprints later when you get 6 times the cost of the sprint back in value.
Yes, and that's because the indicators that you have, the metrics that you use for gauging value, are not always current. Some of them are trailing indicators. Yeah, they're not all leading indicators. Some of them are trailing, and you may not get them for 3 sprints or so. The more closely you can account for value in terms of leading indicators, the better. Yeah. So the way you measure value is going to be important. It's not necessarily going to be cost. It could be the way you understand value could simply be that you've gone and proven an hypothesis. That could be seen as something as being very valuable in itself because it allows you to project savings, as the Rural Health Minister did there. The Rural Health Minister was able to project certain savings, which informed him that it was worthwhile continuing. But not all of the metrics and the measures that you get are going to be obtained at the end of every sprint. Some of them could be trailing, yeah.
Ian, I've got a question. It's Tom Jones here. Is it fair to say, do you think that value is slightly ambiguous or kind of subjective? So I can imagine there might be some scenarios or some projects where a team allocates maybe 2 sprints to getting foundational work done, maybe pipelines set up and all those kind of good stuff that you have in place. Yeah. So to the team, that's very valuable because it's going to allow them in future to deliver work. Yeah. There's no financial value. So how do you kind of sell that to a stakeholder that's just sees all this money being potentially flushed down the toilet in their eyes, maybe, and kind of getting them to agree to keep funding the project when they're actually seeing no financial value?
Right. So there are two key things to note there. The first is that in Scrum, every sprint yields some value. Not necessarily enough to justify the cost of the sprint, as we've just talked about in the previous question, yeah? I mean, some of the indicators may be trailing. But every sprint should deliver some value. So if all you're doing is setup work and you're not delivering even one user story or even one scenario of a user story, let's say, then it's not a sprint. You're doing something else. Now, I remember Mike Cohn once said, maybe there's a case for having a project before the project, and you just don't account for that initial setup work in Agile terms at all. It's just going to be a sunk cost, and you just take it out of the equation altogether. But there's another way, which is that if you accept that each sprint must yield value, no matter how small that morsel of value may be, You can use it as an opportunity to validate the foundations that have been created. You see, there's nothing to stop a team in Scrum from expending 99.99% of its effort during the first sprint on setup work, on putting the infrastructure in place. The vast majority of the work that they do can be that. But if they're sensible, what they will do is they will choose the user story or the scenario which does represent some small piece of value, so it validates the foundations they've gone and built. The classic example of this is called a tracer bullet user story, or sometimes it's called a stovepipe prototype. So what they'll do is typically they'll have some kind of vertical function, okay, which they will implement. It might just be one scenario, it might be a happy path scenario within a user story, but which exercises an architecture from top to bottom, from the user interface to the middleware, right down to a persistence layer, and it will give a result back. It'll be a really, really thin and narrow use case, might even be an edge case, but it will exercise a critical path through the infrastructure that's gone and been built in order to validate it. That in itself would be very, very valuable, because they will be able to evidence to a product owner, let's say, okay, you may not have got much this sprint, but we've proven that we can do something that's at least very, very small. We can prove that we are now in a position with all this infrastructure setup we've gone and done to give you something back, no matter how small it is. And if you've got a skilled product owner who's on board with agile ways of working, that product owner will indeed value that. It's not going to justify the costs of that first sprint, and the value may not emerge for 2 or 3 sprints, okay? But they will be getting something. And that's what really makes it a sprint, you see, the fact that some value is delivered, no matter how small. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does, thank you.
Ian, can I just expand on that? And this may be slightly rhetorical by nature, but we talk about value, and so many people perceive that as pound, shilling, and pence.
Yes.
And I mean, how would you recommend? Our team did a tracer bullet. We did exactly that.
Yeah.
The thinnest slices possible to prove the concept, and the real value was understanding whether our theories actually stood up, and actually, was it worth now investing more in doing this?
That's innovation accounting, yeah.
Right. So now we were lucky in so much as we had a mature product owner that understood the concept of it. But it was his challenge to go and sell that to the wider stakeholder groups and say, hey, this is how it generally works.
Yeah.
You know? So, I mean, as a Scrum Master, is it up to the Scrum Masters to go out and have those conversations and support the PO? Or is it something we just say, talk to the PO if you want to know that? Or is it, you know what I mean? Is it something we think?
I know what you mean. So, a Scrum Master has a service to the wider organisation. Okay, it's if you haven't read the Scrum Guide for a while, it's worth going back and just having a look at that, because the Scrum Master isn't just there, narrowly focused on a team. The Scrum Master is an agile coach. The Scrum Master is someone who helps set up other agile initiatives elsewhere in the enterprise, which is something that not many people appreciate. But, it's definitely part of the role. It's baked right there in the Scrum Guide. Scrum Guide doesn't say much. It's only about 16, 17 pages or so. But it's very, very clear that this Scrum Master role isn't just narrowly focused on a team. There is a service to the wider organization. That includes coaching product owners, includes coaching stakeholders in what behaviors are useful, which ones aren't useful, coaching people in how they should engage with Scrum teams. It's all of that. Yeah, so a Scrum Master should be reaching out and doing those things. The issue, though, is that a Scrum Master is not often recognized as having that. Okay? Scrum Master is not often recognised as having that role. You can be hired as Scrum Master.
I guess part 2 of my question, you've kind of got to where I wanted you to get with this. I said it was slightly rhetorical. So part 2 of my question is, how do Scrum Masters then change that? Because I think that's some of our biggest challenges when we talk about value.
Yeah.
It's all about the pound or the cost, and it's not about those softer things and that you know, where we can make a difference. So how would, if you were a Scrum Master in an organisation that was only utilising a third of your repertoire, how would you go about having those conversations and you know, trying to change that status quo?
So there's a good rule of thumb. There's always there's invariably a step one that you've got to go through for this. The kind of organizations that you're talking about where they don't appreciate that, then they're not likely to be product-focused organizations. They're likely to be working in project space, yeah? And they are perhaps hiring you as a Scrum Master to execute projects faster and cheaper, you know, the classic error. What you need to do in order to be able to do your job well as a Scrum Master properly is to coach the organization, first of all, to develop that product focus. Never mind the project so much. What products have we got? So you can actually have product owners there who care to maximize value. I mean, one anti-pattern is having a product owner who's really just a rebadged project manager who asks you as a Scrum Master, when will the project be done? You know, that's not an unusual anti-pattern to find. The organization needs to move away from that to become product focused. That's a pretty good rule of thumb, really. I mean, it's certainly usual that that's going to be the step you've got to go through. Once you've got that foundation of having a product focused organization, then you can start making the move towards Agile, including building out your role as a Scrum Master. Without going through that first step of having that product focus, you're probably just going to be paying lip service to Scrum, to Agile ways of working. And, you know, those people who are looking to you to be a Scrum Master at all aren't going to be satisfied by the results. So there's that intermediate step of developing that product focus. And from there, of course, once you've got a product focus, you can start looking for not necessarily products, but for things that might be services, for value streams of one sort or another. Yeah, you can then start having an even more mature conversation with stakeholders and senior executives about the value streams that they have in their portfolio rather than projects. And part of this is explaining, you know, the issues like the setup cost and cost of the project. You know, things that are probably beyond the scope of what we need to talk about here, but it's developing that product focus, I would say, is the first step. Without that, you're going to struggle.
Cool. Yeah, so I'm just listening to what you're saying, and what I'm trying to join up here is if we're gonna really be able to articulate the value of moving to an innovation accounting model.
Yes.
You almost need those things to be understood first, because otherwise it's just going to feel like a really hard sell.
Yeah, you're going to be spinning your wheels. That's my experience anyhow. I mean, I can't say I've ever really successfully engaged with an organization in terms of, you know, being a well-rounded Scrum Master without having had those conversations about products. I mean, they've got to go through the product journey first. You know, otherwise they're just going to be looking at having you there as some kind of agile project manager who's going to do things faster and cheaper, rather than building the right thing at the right time.
Thanks very much.
Does anyone disagree, by the way? Does anyone have any different experiences?
No, but it can be quite depressing when you realise that you're in that world. Sorry, the reality is that you're thinking, no, that's exactly the project they are replacing the project, and they're kind of going. What you're saying is, oh well, then we kind of, that's tough.
Yeah, I mean, we've got to be careful and make sure that, you know, we don't sort of say that projects themselves are verboten in Scrum or an Agile way of working. We just need to change the dialogue, so we say, look, a sprint is a project. So when you want to know, I mean, my classic answer, and I'm not being glib here at all, I'm absolutely serious. My classic answer when I'm asked when will the project be done, I give a very, very specific date. It'll be the end of the sprint. That's when it's going to be done. The end of this sprint, we will be done. And there'll be a definition of done that we'll be meeting as well. And, you know, that leads to a lot of head scratching. But, you know, if you keep on with that, with making it obvious that the sprint is a project, it should be providing something of value, and that's what you would base any future decisions upon. Yeah. So You can change the tone of the conversation that way by just looking at the sprint as being the project. And on top of that, you've got this wider product focus that you need to encourage, but the sprint itself is a project that should be yielding an outcome. Not an easy conversation to have, but there you go. Any other questions?
I wanted to say something about when you said when someone asks a Scrum Master about when will the project be done, finished. I think in a reality world, in a real world, I think we always turn to developers. That's my own belief, that we don't go to the product owner or Scrum Master. We always go to the ask developers, when are we going to finish this project? And we don't know, because we realize that we need to get some API, we need to do this, we need to talk to solution architect, and then before you know, you realize that we're not going to finish this project in 1 month as been estimated.
Well, the point I'd raise there is, if your product owner or that are coming to you and asking that question, what it suggests at a fundamental level is there is a communication breakdown. There is a communication breakdown from your development team through to your product owner, through to whoever's asking them the question, that there's not a clarity in the vision. There's not a clarity in the expectation. That's not necessarily that's not an agile issue, that's not an innovation accounting or a precise accounting issue. That is an absolute fundamental core communication problem. And that's because either somebody has asked a question, has been given an answer that they haven't understood and has nodded and said, yes, I do understand it, or the way that the answer has been given back to them hasn't been in a way that they've been able to understand it.
It's a complete misunderstanding of the fact that you turned the whole triangle on its head, right? With traditional projects, we fix the scope, we vary the time, and we vary the resources, right? As we all know, we've all been there 100 times. And hopefully, people are beginning to understand you turn that upside down. The scope's the variable now. As Ian said, when's it finish? Finishes every sprint. End of every sprint, we can stop, we can do something different. That's when it finishes. All you're changing is the scope. So yeah, if there's people asking those questions, they just fundamentally don't understand. And we're back to that as Scrum Masters or Agile people. That's what we're here for, is to keep reminding people or educate people and communicate to people.
And that's maybe where you need to almost take them back to reiterate back to them. There's actually, do you know what, this is where we were 3 weeks ago. This is where we are now. These are the steps to Ian's diagram earlier on the Agile small squares of going, you take RS at the moment, we're trying to get away from a monolith to a microservice-based environment. There are a lot of small steps to make before you actually start to see something potentially viable in an environment that you can then ping. But you've got to take people on that journey with you and explain it to them in a way that they understand, to go, right, if you don't understand, right, dedicate some time to sitting down with them and reiterate it and explain it to them again.
Yep, I would agree with that.
I think there's a common misconception with Scrum and Agile being less disciplined than traditional frameworks or methodologies. But when we look at what we do, discipline is paramount, and the real discipline is deliver incremental value and get the feedback and adjust accordingly. That's the real discipline. And if you build on that message, hopefully turning that triangle over will get easier. But you physically, the only way you're really going to get them to get it is to physically prove at the end of each sprint that you've delivered something. And the real value is the insight. Am I backing the right horse here? Do I want me to continue with this thing, or do I want to start again? You're almost proving things sprint by sprint. And that, pound, shillings, pence, great, but that ultimately is the value, to say that you're doing things in the right way. And if you're not, you've learned about it fast and you can change course.
Even building, to Tom's point earlier, where Tom was saying about, where you've got setup stuff, even doing the setup stuff like building out a dev CI environment or building a pipeline that gets you to an AWS environment or something like that, actually in terms of, let's say, a particular product, there might be limited value from it. But the things that you might have tripped up on the way, that you then go, hang on a minute, I've got a whole bunch of network stuff that I didn't know I've got. There's a whole bunch of value that you've learned that might not necessarily have a financial dollar attached to it, but it's actually going to mean that when it comes to pulling the trigger on it, you'll have dealt with those.
But in the real world, most people always believe that value has to be something that has to come with financial stuff.
But it doesn't matter whether it's a waterfall project or an agile project or a Kanban project. There are some core fundamentals like you're going to need a pipeline, some hardware. Those things don't have a physical value. They have a physical cost, and you have to do them, because if you don't, you can't get anywhere to put something. And that's, people have this misconception that because you do Scrum, or because you do Agile, all of a sudden the magic fairy dust comes along and everything comes back with a value.
It's back to that definition of value again as well, and disassociating it with pure monetary income type stuff, right? It's a value to the business, not necessarily to our end user, but it's value to our business. It's going to enable the subsequent spins. It's going to enable us to build more value. Yeah. We've got to have people thinking that that's why we use value.
If you can demonstrate the single thread, then you get people on the side straight away.
Yes. But the top management, they don't see that. They just want you to put something out.
To make that point,
I was just going to say that's the reason why you have a product owner role in Scrum. It's because value can seem to be arbitrary to stakeholders, and stakeholders can have many competing understandings of what value is. So the product owner role is key to Scrum, because that becomes the single accountable person who says what value is. And as long as the stakeholders respect the product owner as an arbiter in that regard, then the product owner is likely to be successful. But you can't have all of these competing voices, each of which has its own understanding of what value is, because it will be, it does mean many things to many different people. And the product owner provides focus for that, so you've got that single authority about what value really is. That was the point I was going to make.
So, Ian, do you have any way to point product owners in the right direction if they're not getting that? Obviously, as Scrum Masters, we can help them.
Yeah.
If you've got anywhere you say, go and read this book, or go and anything you can think of.
It's certainly there in the Scrum Guide. I think that if the product owner is curious about organizational value, about the bigger picture, what they should have a look at is it's something called the EBM guide, the Evidence-Based Management Guide. You find it on scrum.org. It's there somewhere. You can search for it. It's called the Evidence-Based Management, EBM. And what evidence-based management does is it identifies a number of dimensions over which value can be measured. There's, let's see if I can remember them. There's current value, there's unearned value, there's time to market, and there's ability to innovate. Those are the four key axes or dimensions across which value can be measured in an organization. Current value, unrealized value, time to market, and ability to innovate. And those are described there in the EBN guide. And in fact, if you were to go on the product owner course that Scrum.org has to certify as a product owner, they would take you through that. So that's a good starting point, because it's not an easy thing to do to understand value. But there are nevertheless some common patterns that do recur across organizations, and the ability to measure value across those four dimensions. And there are a number of outputs you can look for. There's about 20 of them altogether, 30, I think. That's a good place for a product owner to start.
Great, thank you. Does that feel like a good point to end the Q&A? People here can smell the pizza now, so they'll say yes to that.
I have a burning question which I'm desperate to ask, but not if they're...
Final question, mate.
Which is that, okay, I get everything you said about the good, and I think we all see the good bit, but a lot of us are working in projects where it is definitely a project and it is definitely waterfall. The project I'm working on, the value is not for 3 years down the line, so because it's a replatforming project, so it's a lot about building pipelines and then moving things over in a state. So what I was going to say is, so yes, we've done all that, we're working with the POs, we've done all what we think are the right things, but the stakeholders still say, okay, great, but Phil, do you think we'll be done by January?
Yeah.
Do you think we'll be done? And obviously the answer is, well, it depends what you mean by, what done it means when you say, will it be done? All those things. So how much, as a Scrum Master, do you talked about the things that create the illusion of whether or not something might be getting towards being done.
Mm-hmm.
What in my experience, that's what businesses default to. They default to, it's like the method that you talked about where it creates that illusion of it. So milestoning or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
So my question is, how much as a Scrum Master do you end up supporting that in order to remain professional in a job, professional, knowing that you're only feeding the illusion, not the reality? Do you see what I mean?
I see what you mean, and I don't know whether or not this is
the illusion because I've got no choice.
Yes, and I'm not sure whether or not this is a good time for me to relate to you the number of times I've been fired in organisations because I've had these awkward conversations with them.
Maybe you should have said that at the beginning.
But yeah, I think it's part of the Scrum Master's remit to do that, to have those conversations. What a Scrum Master should not do is to second guess how a product owner accounts for value. A product owner can account for value in some really obscure ways. I mean, so if you've got a replatforming initiative, for example, where it's going to take 3 years or whatever, just to do some technical uplift or whatever, you need a product owner who can define what value is going to be for that. It's not necessarily going to be business value. And that's fine. It doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to be business value. It might be value to the IT department that this thing's happening. But the product owner should be able to have some means of being able to measure it. It might be the amount of they might account for value in terms of the amount of dollars that are saved and being able to retire certain pieces of infrastructure that don't have to pay for licenses, that don't have to pay for upkeep. If things are gradually retired, that might be a way to account for value. It might be that they can account for value, and this is another fallback position. A product owner can sometimes account for value in terms of risk mitigation. So I was on, let's see, about 2 years ago, I was a consultant at Marks and Spencer's, and we had it was a replatforming initiative. They were moving to the cloud. And value, from the product owner's perspective, was seen simply in terms of the mitigation of risk. Okay, so it may be that certain things are done on a timeline, and each item on the product backlogs that you had was estimated. Its value was estimated in terms of how much risk that effectively was seen to mitigate for the overall initiative. That's fine. That's fine. I mean, you can account for value in terms of risk mitigation, but that doesn't necessarily have to be pounds and pence. So, you need to be really flexible and inventive sometimes as a Scrum Master in terms of the leeway you give product owners and the advice you give them about what value really is. It might just be the mitigation of risk. It's the key thing. The key thing, as I say, is to have that product focus to begin with. To have a product owner who's prepared to be accountable for it, and not just a project manager. That's it. I've kind of run out of things to say on that.
Okay. So that sounds like a good point to say thank you, Ian. So grab a round of applause for Ian.